My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm 34 years old. For the past 8 years, I thought I had found my soulmate in David Martinez. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, where I was working as a freelance graphic designer, struggling to make ends meet while pursuing my passion. David walked in wearing an expensive suit, confidence radiating from every step. He was a successful real estate developer, 12 years older than me, with salt and pepper hair and a smile that could light up a room. When he approached my table and complimented my work, I felt like I had been chosen by someone who truly saw my potential. The early days of our relationship felt like a fairy tale. David would take me to upscale restaurants I could never afford, surprise me with weekend getaways to wine country, and tell me how refreshing it was to meet someone so genuine and talented. He seemed fascinated by my creativity, often watching me work for hours, praising my attention to detail. Within 6 months, he suggested I move into his penthouse apartment overlooking Elliott Bay. The view was breathtaking, and I felt like I was finally living the life I had always dreamed of. But looking back now, I realized that the signs were there from the beginning. David had a way of making suggestions that felt like gentle guidance, but were actually directives. When I mentioned wanting to expand my client base, he would say things like, "You're so talented, but you're undercharging. Let me help you figure out proper pricing." Before I knew it, he was reviewing all my contracts, negotiating with my clients, and essentially managing my entire business. At first, I was grateful. My income tripled under his guidance, and I finally felt like a real professional. However, as months turned into years, I began to notice that my independence was slowly eroding. David would make comments about certain clients being beneath my skill level, or not worth my time. Gradually, my client list shrank to only the high-paying projects he approved of. When I expressed concern about putting all my eggs in one basket, he would reassure me that quality was better than quantity, and that he was only looking out for my best interests. By our 3rd year together, I had become completely financially dependent on David. He insisted on paying all the household expenses, claiming it was more efficient since he made significantly more money. My freelance income, while higher per project, became irregular due to his selective approach to my client base. When I suggested maybe I should take on some smaller projects to maintain cash flow, he would get that look in his eyes, a mixture of hurt and disappointment. "I thought we were building something together," he would say. "Don't you trust my judgment? Haven't I proven that I know what's best for your career?" The emotional manipulation was so subtle that I didn't recognize it at first. David had a gift for making me feel like his opinions were actually my own realizations. When I would express interest in taking a design class or attending a networking event, he would listen patiently, then point out potential downsides I hadn't considered. "Of course, if that's what you really want," he would say, "but remember how overwhelmed you felt last time you took on too much. I just want you to be happy and stress-free." Slowly, my world became smaller. Friends from my pre-David life began to fade away, partly because I was always busy with work or spending time with him, and partly because he had a way of making subtle criticisms about them. "Jessica seems a bit dramatic, don't you think?" Or, "I noticed Mike kept interrupting you at dinner. Real friends should respect your voice more." These comments would plant seeds of doubt that grew over time. The isolation became more pronounced when David suggested we should think about our future together more seriously. He proposed to me on a romantic weekend in Paris, presenting a stunning 3-carat diamond ring. I was overwhelmed with joy, but also felt a strange undercurrent of anxiety that I couldn't quite identify. When we returned home and began planning the wedding, David naturally took the lead. He had connections, he explained, and knew the best vendors. Besides, wedding planning was stressful, and he wanted me to be able to focus on my work. Our engagement period revealed new dimensions of David's controlling nature. He had strong opinions about everything from the guest list to my wedding dress. When I suggested inviting some of my college friends, he would review the list and make comments like, "Are you sure about Rachel? Remember how she always seems to create drama?" Or, "Do you really want Tom there?" He still seems bitter about his divorce. Each time his concerns seemed reasonable, and I found myself agreeing to trim the guest list. The wedding dress shopping experience should have been a red flag. David insisted on coming with me, claiming he wanted to be supportive, but he ended up dominating every appointment. He would shake his head almost imperceptibly at dresses I liked, or make comments about how certain styles weren't flattering for my body type. When I fell in love with a vintage-inspired gown with delicate lace sleeves, he suggested that a more modern, sleek design would photograph better. "You want to look timeless in our wedding photos," he said, "not dated." I ended up choosing a dress that looked beautiful but felt like someone else's choice. After we married, the controlling behavior intensified. David began monitoring our finances more closely, explaining that as a married couple, we needed to be more strategic about our spending. He set up a joint account system where my freelance payments went into our shared account, and he would transfer my allowance to my personal account each month. When I questioned this arrangement, he explained that it was more tax efficient and would help us save for our future home. He showed me spreadsheets and projections, making it seem like a smart financial move rather than a control mechanism. The allowance system made me feel like a child asking for permission to spend money I had earned. If I wanted to buy something beyond basic necessities, I had to discuss it with David first. He never said no outright, but he had a way of making me feel guilty for spending money on things he deemed unnecessary. Of course you can buy those art supplies, he would say, but remember we're trying to save for the down payment on our house. Maybe wait until next month when we have a better sense of our budget? My work began to suffer under this financial arrangement. When clients were slow to pay or when projects fell through, I felt panicked in a way I never had when I was truly independent. David would comfort me during these stressful periods, but his comfort came with subtle reminders of how lucky I was to have his financial stability to fall back on. This is exactly why it's good we're a team, he would say. You can take risks with your creative work because you know I've got us covered. The emotional manipulation reached new heights when I expressed interest in teaching a design workshop at the local community college. It was something I had always wanted to do, and the pay wasn't great, but it would give me a sense of purpose and connection to other creatives. David listened to my enthusiasm, then slowly began pointing out the challenges. The time commitment would be significant, he noted, and the pay was barely above minimum wage. I just want to make sure you're not undervaluing yourself, he said. You're so talented, and this seems like it might be beneath your skill level. When I insisted that it wasn't about the money, but about the fulfillment, David's tone shifted. He became quiet and withdrawn, a behavior pattern I had learned to fear. When I asked what was wrong, he would sigh deeply and say something like, I just thought we were on the same page about building our future together. If you want to spend your time teaching beginners for almost no money, that's your choice, but it feels like a step backward from everything we've been working toward. The guilt was overwhelming. Here was this man who had helped elevate my career, who had given me financial security, who had married me and was planning our future together, and I was being selfish by wanting something that didn't align with his vision of our life. I withdrew my application from the community college and threw myself back into the high-paying client work that David approved of. But the resentment began to build. I found myself feeling increasingly isolated and dependent. My days revolved around David's schedule and preferences. We socialized primarily with his friends and colleagues, attended events he chose, and lived according to routines he established. When I tried to assert my own preferences, he would listen patiently, then explain why his way was more practical or efficient. The breaking point came during our 5th year of marriage, 3 years after our wedding. I had been working on a particularly challenging project for one of David's business associates, a rebranding campaign for a luxury resort chain. The client was demanding and constantly changing requirements, but the pay was substantial, and David emphasized how important this relationship was for his own business dealings. After weeks of revisions and late nights, I finally delivered what I thought was excellent work. The client approved it, the campaign launched successfully, and I felt a rare sense of professional accomplishment. When the payment came through, however, I discovered that David had negotiated a different fee structure than what I had agreed to. Instead of my usual project rate, he had arranged for me to be paid as a subcontractor through his company, which meant a significantly reduced fee after his company took its cut. When I confronted him about this, David seemed genuinely surprised by my reaction. I thought you knew, he said. This is how we handle all the projects that come through my network. It's better for taxes, and it helps establish my company's design capabilities for future projects. I thought you'd be happy that we're building our business together. I stared at him, feeling like I was seeing clearly for the first time in years. Our business, I asked. This is my work, David. My skills, my time, my creativity. How is it our business when you take a cut of what I earn? His expression shifted to that familiar look of hurt disappointment. I can't believe you're making this about money, he said. Everything I do is for us, for our future. I provide the connections, the credibility, the business structure that allows you to charge premium rates. Do you think you'd be earning this much on your own? That question hung in the air between us, and I realized it was the crux of our entire relationship. David had systematically dismantled my independence and then positioned himself as my savior. He had isolated me from my support network, made me financially dependent, and convinced me that my success was actually his success, that I owed my professional achievements to his guidance and connections. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while David slept peacefully beside me. I thought about the woman I had been before I met him, the one who had been struggling but free, who had made her own choices and lived with the consequences. I thought about the dreams I had abandoned, the friendships I had let fade, the opportunities I had declined because they didn't fit into David's vision of our life. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my old friend Jessica, the one David had labeled as dramatic. Her voice lit up when she heard from me, and we talked for 2 hours. She told me about her new job, her recent breakup, her plans to travel to Thailand. She asked about my work, and when I tried to give my usual polished response about high-end clients and luxury projects, she cut me off. "Sarah," she said gently, "you sound miserable. What happened to the woman who used to get excited about designing logos for local coffee shops and nonprofit organizations? You used to care about using your talents to help small businesses and good causes." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I had forgotten that version of myself, the one who found joy in helping a family restaurant create their first professional menu, or designing promotional materials for a local animal shelter. That woman had been replaced by someone who measured success only in dollar amounts and client prestige. After hanging up with Jessica, I sat in my home office, surrounded by the expensive equipment David had bought me, looking out at the stunning view he had provided, and I felt empty. This beautiful life felt like a prison, and I was the one holding the keys. That evening, when David came home from work, I told him I wanted to have a serious conversation about our marriage and my career. He poured himself a glass of wine and settled into his favorite chair, ready to listen with that patient expression I knew so well. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," I began, "about whether I'd be earning as much on my own. And you're right, I probably wouldn't be. But I've realized that's not the right question." David's eyebrows raised slightly, but he remained silent. "The right question," I continued, "is whether I'd be happier, whether I'd feel fulfilled, whether I'd feel like myself." "Of course you should feel fulfilled," David said smoothly. "That's why we've worked so hard to build your reputation and client base. You're doing prestigious work that showcases your talents." "But they're not my clients," I said. "They're yours. And when you take a percentage of my earnings, I'm not a wife building a life with her husband. I'm an employee in a company I don't own." David's expression began to harden. "That's not fair, Sarah. Everything I've done has been to support your career. I've given you opportunities you never would have had access to. I've provided you with financial security so you could take creative risks." "What creative risks?" I asked. "When was the last time I took on a project that excited me creatively but didn't meet your financial criteria? When was the last time I worked with a client who needed my help more than they needed to boost your business reputation?" The conversation continued for hours, with David alternating between hurt confusion and subtle manipulation tactics I now recognized clearly. He reminded me of all the ways he had supported me, all the sacrifices he had made, all the benefits I had gained from our partnership. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty. I felt angry. Over the following weeks, I began to take small steps toward reclaiming my independence. I reached out to old friends, researched my legal rights regarding our joint finances, and quietly began reconnecting with former clients who had been deemed unsuitable by David's standards. The first project I took on without David's knowledge was a logo design for a local women's shelter. The pay was minimal, but the work felt meaningful in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. As I worked on the design, incorporating symbols of strength and hope, I felt a spark of the passion that had originally drawn me to graphic design. When David discovered what I was doing, the facade of supportive partnership finally cracked completely. He was furious, not just about the project itself, but about my deception. "How can you go behind my back like this?" he demanded. "After everything we've built together, how can you jeopardize our professional reputation with this kind of amateur work?" "It's not amateur work," I said calmly. "It's work that matters to me. And I didn't go behind your back. I made a decision about my own career. Your career is our career, David shot back. Your reputation affects mine. Your choices affect our future. And there it was, the truth he had been dancing around for years. In David's mind, I wasn't a partner. I was an asset. My talents, my time, my decisions were all extensions of his ambitions and his vision of success. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop and began researching divorce attorneys. I wasn't ready to take that step yet, but I needed to understand my options. What I discovered was both frightening and liberating. Because David had structured our finances in such a controlling way, and because I had lost touch with my independent client base, leaving him would mean starting over from almost nothing. But as I sat there in the dark, considering the prospect of rebuilding my life from scratch, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement. The idea of being responsible for my own success and failures, of making my own choices and living with the consequences, was terrifying and thrilling. The next few months were a careful balancing act. I began secretly saving money from the small projects I took on without David's knowledge. I reconnected with old friends and started building a support network outside of David's sphere of influence. I researched apartments I could afford on my own and began planning for a future that didn't include his financial safety net. The final catalyst came when David announced that he had arranged for me to work on a major project for one of his biggest clients, a luxury hotel chain. The project would require me to work closely with their marketing team for 6 months, effectively becoming a temporary employee of David's company. When I expressed reservations, he brushed them aside. "This is the opportunity we've been working toward," he said. "This could establish you as the go-to designer for high-end hospitality brands. It's everything we've planned for." As he outlined the project, I realized that we had never included my actual preferences or goals. David had created a career path for me that served his vision of success, and I had been so grateful for his support that I had never stopped to consider whether it was the path I wanted to walk. That weekend, while David was at a business conference, I packed a single suitcase and moved into a small studio apartment across town. I left behind the beautiful penthouse, the expensive furniture, the lifestyle I had grown accustomed to. But I took with me my laptop, my portfolio, and something I had almost lost completely: my sense of self. The note I left for David was simple: "I need to find out who I am when I'm not trying to be who you need me to be. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk about our future." The first few weeks of living alone were harder than I had anticipated. The studio apartment was tiny and sparse compared to the luxury I had grown used to. My savings were limited, and I had to take on whatever projects I could find, regardless of prestige or pay. Some nights, I ate ramen noodles for dinner and wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. But gradually, something wonderful began to happen. As I worked with small business owners who were passionate about their dreams, as I designed materials for nonprofit organizations making a real difference in their communities, as I struggled to make ends meet with my own efforts, I began to remember who I had been before David reshaped me. The woman who emerged from those months of struggle was different from both the naive freelancer David had first met and the polished professional he had molded me into. She was stronger, more self-aware, and deeply committed to using her talents in service of her own values rather than someone else's ambitions. When David and I finally sat down to talk about our marriage, 6 months after I had moved out, we were essentially strangers. He had spent those months trying to understand what had gone wrong, convinced that he could fix our relationship if he could just identify the problem and solve it. But the problem wasn't something that could be fixed, because it was the foundation of our entire relationship. "I don't understand," he said, looking genuinely confused. "I gave you everything. A beautiful home, financial security, professional opportunities you never could have accessed on your own. What more did you want?" "I wanted to be a partner," I replied, "not a project." The divorce was complicated but not contentious. David was hurt and confused, but he wasn't vindictive. In his mind, he had been the perfect husband, and my leaving was an incomprehensible act of self-sabotage. He couldn't understand why someone would choose struggle over security, independence over guidance, uncertainty over his carefully planned future. As I rebuilt my life and career on my own terms, I often reflected on the years I had spent in that relationship. I didn't regret the experience entirely, because it had taught me valuable lessons about my own boundaries and priorities. But I mourned the time I had lost, the opportunities I had missed, and the relationships I had damaged by allowing someone else to define my worth and my goals. The hardest part of recovery wasn't the financial struggle or the loneliness of starting over. It was learning to trust my own judgment again. After years of having someone else make decisions for me, even small choices felt overwhelming. What kind of coffee did I actually like? Which movies did I want to watch? What kind of work brought me genuine satisfaction? Slowly, through trial and error, I began to rediscover my authentic preferences and desires. I took on projects that paid little but filled me with purpose. I rekindled friendships that David had subtly discouraged. I took a pottery class just because it sounded fun, not because it would advance my career in any way. A year after my divorce was finalized, I was invited to speak at a workshop for women entrepreneurs about building sustainable creative businesses. As I prepared my presentation, I realized that my story wasn't really about the failure of my marriage to David. It was about the success of my marriage to myself. The woman who stood up to speak that day was someone I had never been before. Confident in her own judgment, clear about her values, and unafraid to prioritize her own well-being. She had learned that love without respect is manipulation, that support without autonomy is control, and that the most important relationship you'll ever build is the one you have with yourself. Today, 3 years after leaving David, I run a small but thriving design studio that specializes in working with nonprofit organizations and small businesses. My income is a fraction of what it was during my marriage, but every dollar I earn is mine. My apartment is small and modest, but it reflects my taste and my choices. My days are my own to structure, my projects are my own to choose, and my future is my own to create. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have looked like if I had never met David, if I had continued on my original path without his intervention. But I've learned that regret is just another form of allowing someone else to control your story. The woman I am today exists because of everything I've experienced, including the years I spent losing myself in someone else's vision of my life. The most important lesson I learned is that the person who truly loves you will never ask you to become smaller so they can feel bigger. They will never make their support conditional on your compliance. They will never position themselves as the author of your success story. Real love creates space for you to grow into your fullest potential, even if that growth leads you away from the person who loves you. It celebrates your independence, even when that independence is inconvenient. It trusts your judgment even when it disagrees with your choices. I am still learning to love myself this way, to be patient with my mistakes, to trust my instincts, and to prioritize my own well-being without guilt. It is the hardest and most rewarding work I have ever done. As I write this, sitting in my small home office with a cup of coffee I chose because I love the way it tastes, working on a project I selected because I believe in its mission, I feel something I spent years searching for in the wrong places. Contentment. Not the kind that comes from external validation or financial security, but the kind that comes from knowing that the life you're living is authentically your own. The journey from dependence to independence, from confusion to clarity, from someone else's vision to your own authentic path is not easy, but it is always worth taking. Because at the end of that journey, you don't just find yourself, you find your home.